Hey, everybody, this is Brett Ingram. This is the optYOUmize podcast, a show that helps entrepreneurs build their dream business and dream life. Today, we're talking with John Cousins, best-selling author, entrepreneur, speaker, investor, and professor who's taken two companies public. He's the founder of MBA ASAP with over 30,000 students in 165 countries, delivering skills education to lift learners and empower communities. I'm personally super excited about this because he's seen and done so much, and he's got a really refreshing perspective on education and success. So, with that, welcome, John. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Oh, Brad, thanks so much. My pleasure. I'm really looking forward to this too.
I am too. I think what you've done and what you're doing are both fascinating and so important as well. So, I have a ton of stuff that I want to talk to you about and ask you about. But can we start off with your personal story? I'm curious. Can you share your background with us? How you started your career in the beginning?
Oh, you bet. And yeah, the arc, it's funny. It's like you can only connect the dots in retrospect, really. Life is lived forward, but you can only understand it sort of looking backwards in a way. And yeah, what a long, strange trip it's been, kind of thing. But yeah, I started out. I started out. After high school, I went to engineering school, and I ended up at Northeastern University in Boston. And for me, I went around with my dad and looked at a whole bunch of colleges, and we looked at some in small towns and some in big towns, in cities and stuff. And I really didn't have much of a clue. I grew up in New Jersey, in sort of a leafy dormitory community for New York City, outside of Newark, New Jersey, and and that was my world. That's all I knew was high school and that world, and sports and girls and just all this different things. And so when I actually picked a university to go to, I really didn't have a clue. And only after I went to Boston, I was in Boston for maybe a year or two. At first, I went there and I actually talk about personal development. I really did a self transformation. I said, I'm, gonna, when I was in high school, it was like all about um, sort of being a partying jock, kind of thing, and also studying a lot, and really being into at that time. The music was just driving a lot of intellectual activity, like even things like the Doors, their name was from the Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley, and that would bring me to literature and all these kind of things. So my mind was really expanding because of the music into literature and art and all these things. And I didn't realize though until I was up in Boston for really probably a year or more. And so when I went up to Boston, I decided I'm going to stop, any kind of alcohol, any kind of smoking pot, any of that kind of stuff, and really study hard as I could. And I changed my wardrobe and I sort of reinvented myself because like suddenly I was in an environment where no one knew me anymore, really. And I could say, who do I want to be now? And it wasn't like, I was surrounded by parents or kids who knew me in second grade, kind of thing. And so I could really just say, this is what I want to be now. And I kind of put on a persona. It was really interesting as I look back on it. And and it was after a couple of years I realized, my gosh, I got lucky and found a place that was just right sized and right for me. And so there I could really expand and grow. And there was all kinds of art houses for movies, concerts coming through. There's 500 universities there and 500,000 college students at that time, and still to this day. And so surrounded by lots of people with similar interests and all of the businesses catering to that kind of crowd, it was wonderful. And I kind of just lucked out, and that was a huge growing experience for me. I started out as a mechanical engineering student, and then I got a job at ARP Instruments, which was really an inflection point in my life. It was ARP Instruments. It was a early synthesizer company. I really wanted to be in the music field, and that company was building these synthesizers that all the big, Stevie Wonder and Pete Towns and all these guys were using and making really cool records. And I lucked into a job there, and um, uh, and so I quit school and I just worked there and went up the path from just soldering on the tables to becoming the final test engineer for these big synthesizers within 6 months. And while I was there, one of the other guys there was going to a night program at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in electronics. And it was this program that they set up to re-educate what they call tube jockeys. They're electronics guys that had been working with tube electronics, and tube electronics now have come back. Like, if audiophiles and stuff, they love to buy tube amps, and musicians will buy, guitar players will buy tube amp, amplifiers and stuff. But at that time, it was the big move from tubes to semiconductors, and that exploded the entire, exponential curve of electronics that we know to this day. That's just been unbelievable. So I thought that was really interesting. So I started in that program too. I thought that's a great program. And that's where I really learned about electronics and all. And plus I was working as an electronic guy at this company. Um, and so when I went, then after about 6 months, I realized that's about as far as I can get in this company. And so I went back to school, and I decided I wanted to go back. Instead of studying mechanical engineering, I wanted to study literature. In my other, so I started studying literature, and then I decided I'm just going to make my own major. And I just picked the courses. I went to Boston University at that time, and I picked courses that were interesting to me, and then the professors that people said were really good. And that was my sort of my criteria. Instead of like, I'm going to be in this set lane and go this path. And at the end, I cobbled it together and got a degree in electronic music and media production. And that's really what I wanted to do. And at the same time, while I was going to BU, I stayed in that MIT program at night. And so I graduated from both of them at the same time. And then I moved to New York and started working in rock and roll recording studios. I started at the record plant, and at that time, it was the biggest. John Lennon had recorded there, Imagine, and then it was, David Bowie was there, Blondie was there doing Parallel Lines, Talking Heads are doing Fear of Music. I met Brian Eno there. Aerosmith was there. Bruce Springsteen had just finished Born to Run. Before that, and so it was a big studio, where everybody was doing this stuff. But I was at the low man at the totem pole, and I really didn't like that because I'd been working in recording studios, and I was like, recording in Boston. So I went around, got another job at another studio, and did that. And from there, luckily, my boss got a a fellow came in from Ampex, which made all of the recording, professional recording, audio and video, and asked my boss there if he wanted a job, as the audio video, marketing guy for the Northeast. And he said no, but I know a guy who'd be perfect for it. And he introduced me to him. God bless him. And I got that job. And they were based out of Redwood City, California. It was an early Silicon Valley kind of company. And I went out there and trained up on video as well, did all that, and did that for a couple of years all over the country. And then that was a place for the networks at the time, the television networks, to poach engineers from Ampex because they had all the Ampex equipment. And so once Ampex had trained them up and they knew all the stuff, then they would, poach the engineers. So that's what happened to me. I got hired by ABC Television and became an audio video systems designer there, and did that for a decade all over the world. My clients were sports and news. We were the broadcast operations and engineering department, and worked on all kinds of great programming, putting on Monday Night Football and World Series and space shuttle launches, political conventions, absolutely fun, super fun. I was in my 20s, and it was just an incredible job. And I ascended up that career. Um, and then one day I picked up, ABC's annual report, and they had been acquired by a company called Capital Cities, which was funded by Warren Buffett. And it was a time of these leverage buyouts were the big thing. These companies were
Right.
acquiring companies with junk bonds fueled by, Drexel Burnham and Michael Milken. And, they get all this, cheap money and go and acquire companies. And I was like, what the heck is that? My company just got acquired by, and looked at the annual report and was flipping through it. And there's these financial statements in there, balance sheet, income statement, cash flow statement, all that stuff. And I realized, I was in the numbers world, of engineering, but I couldn't understand what the heck these were. And I always thought at some point I'd like to get an MBA, So then I decided I'm going to go and get my MBA. So I applied to one school. I applied to Wharton. That's the only school I ended up applying to, and got in at the University of Pennsylvania. Moved from New York to Philly for a couple of years and went to Wharton. And it was a fantastic experience. Um, I really wanted to reevaluate my career. And when you're deep in it, it's hard to get a sense of perspective of what you want to do next or what you want to be. And I was 32, at that time. I had a 3-year-old son. I had a family, young family, and I'll tell you what, bailing out of a job that was making substantial money and moving to another town, having all the living expenses of a family, you know, uh, plus the tuition costs, and not making any money during that time, I ended up digging myself a, $400,000 hole as a young person. And later on, I started realizing, or thinking, was that the smartest way to do this? Because it took me a long time to pay off the student debt, to I had saved up a retirement fund. I spent all that, at that time, and so I was really starting from scratch in the negatives. But I thought that this was a good thing, and something. And over time, it turned out to be. But there was a lot of you know hard times coming out of that dip, and so that's one of the impetuses for creating MBA ASAP. It's like, I can deliver this kind of information very quickly to people for very inexpensively, and you don't have to go and, quit your job or quit what you're doing to get that skill stack of business skills. So then
Yeah.
I started to, that was when I left ABC. That was the last time I had a boss. I decided I didn't want to work in it. I chafed at the environment, as an entrepreneur does, right? You chafe at the environment of working for a company. They tell you where to go. Here's your plane ticket. You're going to Minneapolis, tomorrow, and you're going to work on this. And you're always on call for them, and having bosses that you have to sort of suck up to and manage up. And I didn't work well in that environment. I had to put on a persona of myself that I really didn't feel was me to fit into a corporate setting. And so that was the last. I decided I'm going to just work for myself and work, have partners and stuff and do entrepreneurial things. And that's what I started doing. And, through that process, learned that, I've started well over a dozen companies, like you said, Brett. I took 2 of them public. I've had other exits and all other ones that have completely failed, for other reasons. And through that process, I also realized, that having partners, equal partners, can be a real challenge. Uh,
Mhm.
Having investors can be a real challenge, because once you're essentially hiring a boss, and all they want to know is, are you making money for me? When are you going to sell this company? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's, having big customers can be a real challenge too, because then they sort of bend what you're doing to conform to what they want. Um, and having employees can be a challenge. It's almost like babysitting sometimes. You have these people, and everybody has a problem. Everybody has to take a break. Everybody wants more money. Everybody wants to work less. It's like that old thing. People. You pay people just enough so they don't, quit, and they work just enough so they don't get fired. And you can get into that kind of, race to the bottom kind of thing. So I really, over time, sort of peeled off all those things, big customers, investors, partners, employees, and became right, what I am now is a solopreneur. That's become a thing. And that's only become a thing because of the confluence of all these different technologies that have made it
Yeah.
that we can actually automate things and leverage things, and hire consultants and stuff, so you can build a mosaic of talent that you need right for a time, and then disperse that, when things are over. You don't have to worry at night about making payroll and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I mean, that's amazing, and I have to say, the AI element of it and all the technology and the broadband internet has really changed it, because I had a brick and mortar business back in the day, and you couldn't do it yourself, right? As a solopreneur, I mean, we built custom configured PCs and shipped them all over the United States, and so we had an advertising budget. We advertised in the back of magazines at the time, because that's what it was. There was no internet really, right? It was just sort of starting. The e-com side of it, anyway, was really, really in its infancy, and we were building out a website to be able to sell online. But the reality of it is you had to put some skin in the game. You needed some money, you needed some capital. And like you said, the fascinating sort of tensions in business are the fact that while you go into it typically for that control and for that freedom, the more stakeholders you have in what you're doing, the less freedom you ultimately have, because you have to make sure your employees are happy. Otherwise, they aren't going to treat the customers good. If you have investors, they want to know, where's the bottom line? When am I getting my money back? And when am I getting my profit? You know what I mean? And so, if you, obviously from every angle, you're still being pulled in those directions, but now you also have a lot more responsibility. When you work a job, you go in, you do your shift or whatever it is. And even if your salary, whatever, when you're done for the day, you can clock out, you go home. When you own a business, you don't ever unplug. You might physically take time off, but it's on your mind. And I think you have to be built a certain way for entrepreneurship to. But something you said really struck a chord with me, because you said, when you were working for other people, you sort of recognized the fact that you didn't want to be told what to do, and where to go and all that. And I had that same bristling sort of feeling when I worked in companies when I was younger. I have to say, with the exception of one, I worked with one, and I was a little jaded about corporate America, because my father was one of those people that was the lifer that got laid off after the 25 years because the downsizing was a really big thing. And here was a guy that built his career being loyal to his company, expecting to work there forever, worked really hard at what he did, was good at it, but he was being paid too much. He was not skilled enough to be unique. So they were like, okay, he worked in the insurance industry. So these giant conglomerates, and they basically just dumped all of their expensive staff so they could bring in, new college grads. And so the rules of the game got changed in the middle for him. And that was really formative for me, because I was in college at the time. My father got laid off, and that was a little terrifying. And so it's interesting how the other thing you said in the very, very beginning is how it's funny how when you look back through the lens of experience, you can see how all the dots connect. But when you're going through the process, you don't quite get it. The number of people that I've talked to that have done so many different things that seem completely unrelated. And when you talk to them about what they're doing today, it's this magical combination of all these things where you're drawing this experience from that, and that experience from this, and they're putting it all together in a way where it all actually makes sense, and it's crazy,
Yep.
but it is super cool.
It is super cool, and I agree with you. And you said a number of things there that really resonate with me. And I'll start with um, if I have my best friend that I knew since he was 4 and I was 5. He worked in marine insurance on Wall Street, and he worked for Star and these other big AGI, AIG, all these big insurance companies. And that's exactly what happened to him. He got into his 50s. They laid him off, and it happened to a bunch of those guys. And we think that by taking the corporate path, we're taking the less risky path. That we have a job, and if you do entrepreneurship, it's too risky. What are you gonna, what if it fails? What if you don't do, and 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 it turns out that the path that we think is less risky turns out to be really risky. And people, it's like a turkey, right? A turkey has a wonderful life. They're feeding and everything's great until Thanksgiving comes, and all of a sudden, it's this catastrophic event, and so being an entrepreneur in a way, even though it seems more risky, and there are risks that you have to manage, at the end of the day, because you have that agency and autonomy, you can land on your feet, figure out what to do next, and you gain these skill sets that you can figure out how to fish or whatever, instead of being given a fish every day, you learn how to fish and you get your own fish, that you can survive better, I think, especially in times where you can't really count on corporations because, as you said, artificial intelligence is changing the game so quickly now that so many companies are going to be like Kodak or something when all of a sudden cameras dematerialize into our phone and we didn't need film and cameras anymore, and that whole business went away, and 400,000 people in Rochester, New York got laid off. Businesses are going to self-destruct like that, and you'll be left with the rug pulled out from under you unless you really are riding that wave and embracing the technology and using it and becoming co-creators with it and things like that. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that I hear you about and I feel for you about your father being laid off. The same thing happened to me when I was in college. My dad worked for Ballantine Beer. It was a beer company out of Newark, New Jersey, and he worked there for 30 years as a Teamster. And just as he was getting ready to retire, this corporate raider, a guy who had Falstaff beer, lived on I just remember, lived on a little yacht in San Francisco Harbor. And he bought the company, raided the pensions, just like in that Wall Street movie. And my dad didn't get a pension and he was devastated and he lost his job and didn't have his pension. And that was a huge lesson for me right there to never fully trust corporate America and never put your destiny and fate in others' hands, because even if they have your best interests at heart and all that kind of stuff, the world can change from what they think it is, and suddenly they can't provide for you in that way. And that's sort of paternalistic corporation where you go to work for them, you go to IBM, put on your thing, and you march along and do everything in this conform way, or get your lunch pail after high school and go to the Ford Motor Plant and work there for 30 years, just like you know, everybody else in town did and stuff. And, those kind of experiences can be incredibly devastating when you have your self-worth and your self-esteem tied to something that looks sturdy but is actually fragile, and so yeah, those are
Yeah,
very good
well,
points.
yeah, and I think, to that point, that security is an illusion, right? At the end of the day, your only security is the fact that you continue to sharpen your skills and you make yourself in a position where you have the ability to carve your own path. And so I think it's okay now, only from the perspective of the rules of the game are transparent. The challenge for my dad, and I'm sure yours as well, is the rules changed in the middle of the game and they weren't prepared because nobody expected these kinds of things to happen. So luckily he did get his pension because he was also a pensioner. And however, the crazy thing about his story is that it was literally on his 25th work anniversary. His boss was in Philadelphia. He worked in right outside of Hartford in Connecticut here, and his boss was coming down to lay him off. His friends got wind of it, called the boss and said, "He's getting a cake and a watch today. You can't come down today. It's literally the day of his party." The guy's like, "Okay, I'll wait 2 weeks." So they waited 2 weeks. They came down and they laid him off. And but yeah, so the lesson I got from it is, sure, on the one hand, I was sort of angry at the system and at corporate America, but the other side of it is, what I realized in that time is, okay, so you've got to take care of yourself. And so now that the rules are transparent, look, companies don't have it easy either, because the fact of the matter is, employees recognize that, look, my best bet is to work somewhere for 2.6 years, take the experience I've got, go somewhere else and get a big raise. Because if I stay where I am, not only do they have the ability to lay me off, but I don't look ambitious if I stay here too long. And at the same time, they're not going to reward me because they got me cheap. They got me young, right? And so it isn't the same thing. And it's funny because I was in staffing in the early part of my career and I was in it for 6 years. And the difference in just that 6 year period of time, when I started, they taught me, like, when you look at a resume, if somebody hasn't been somewhere for at least 10 years, you need to dig into why. Like, what's wrong? Are you just not a good employee? Like, that's what you're trying to figure out, because everybody was loyal and they stayed. By the end, 5 6 years later, it was, if you were anywhere more than 4 years, it was like, are you not ambitious? Do you not really care? Like, what's going on? Why are you there so long? Because people were moving around to get the raises. So I think as long as the rules of the game are transparent to the players, it's okay. I think where it gets really ugly is when stuff changes in the middle. And to your point about the uncertainty with that, look, you might have owners that have the best intentions. My father-in-law worked for a company, family-owned company, for decades. They loved him and he was totally secure there. Those guys got old. They wanted to retire. They sold to a major conglomerate. The major conglomerate went in and laid off a bunch of people. Thankfully, he was one that they kept because of his reputation and because of that. but the owners had to literally fight for him. They had to say, if look, we don't care, but this guy and a few of these other people are people that we've had on the team for a long time. They've given their life to this business. So we want you to keep them. You know what I mean? If you, we understand numbers and numbers, you're going to do what you got to do and we need to cash out, but it's important to us that these people are taken care of. And so to their credit, they did that, but a lot of people wouldn't even do that. And he'd be in the same situation, right? So yeah, I mean, all of that stuff is scary. So getting back to the entrepreneurship side of things, so starting a business is one thing. Taking a business public, taking a company public is no small feat. I mean, that's a watershed moment that a lot of entrepreneurs aspire to and they dream about. What was that like, and how did you actually do it?
Well, that's a great question, Brett. I did it. My first company took public in 1999. And at that time, it was the .com boom. Everything was ascendant. Everything was, .com. It was easy to get money and also to fund companies, publicly because everybody was pouring money into pets.com, all kinds of things that, turned out to be not really fundamentally sound business propositions, but the money was there. And being a private company and being in having investors, one of the things it's really good about being a public company is one, liquidity. You have liquidity. The stock is actually trading, so you can raise money, you can exit, you can sell some stock, things like that. And also, the public markets are the best price discovery mechanism. Basically, that's where you really discover the value of the company. A lot of times to the detriment of the entrepreneur. It's like the markets don't understand my company and they're underpricing me and blah, 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 blah. You get all upset because you think you should be worth much more, right? But it is the reality of here is an auction that's going on in, real time. Trades are being made all the time. You see those ticks up and down. That's the actual auction price of what people are willing to bid for it and to buy it for. And, uh, and so you get a real price discovery and investors then can have liquidity. So they're not stuck. One thing about in a private company, I'm also an angel investor now, and invest in, startups and things. And you put money into a company as an investor, and you're probably not going to see that money for the next 5 years, or maybe 3 years if you're lucky. And if the company doesn't do well, you lose that money. But in 2 years, if you think, oh, I have a better opportunity to repurpose those funds, you can't access them. They're tied up in that company until that company has an exit. So you're really married to that company. But if a company's public, you can say, well, I'm going to invest in Google and I'm going to put my money in here. And 3 weeks later or a year later, whatever, whenever you want, you can decide to sell some or all of it. And the next day you have that in cash again. And so that liquidity is really a great thing. And the pricing mechanism is a great thing at the public markets. So that being said, those are the reasons why I thought it was a good idea. And at that time, you could, I did direct listings basically. I didn't go through a IPO with a investment bank because investment banks take an incredible chunk of the money and they always underprice it. And when they on an initial day, the stock goes from $50 to $75, and they put all their best clients in the stock, so their clients get that money that they left on the table, your money they left on the table, and give it to their best clients to keep their best clients. And so that can, and they take a giant fee for doing it. So what I did was direct listing where you go out and you actually find some market makers because I was going into the over the counter market at first. And you just find market makers but you find market makers that are willing to take the stock. You do the S1 form with the SEC, which is a big uh, form about what the company, all the disclosure information and all. And and then you find some market makers and you take it. You get a symbol awarded by the SEC, and you take it public and you start to rock and roll. And then you have to learn all about that, about the trading and the depth of the stock and having enough news that's going out there to keep investors excited and getting new investors. And that's a whole incredible challenge of itself. And then I took my second company public in 2006. And in the meantime, there the dot-com boom had crashed, and then we had Enron and WorldCom and these fraudulent companies, and so there was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act came into effect with the SEC to try to make it so that the people that signed on the annual reports, the 10Ks, the CFO and the CEO were actually liable for those numbers and things. So you really couldn't do fraud without having some personal skin on that. And the reporting costs went way up. Suddenly, accounting firms because as a reporting company, once you go public too, you have to report, disclose every quarter to the SEC, you know, uh, uh, audited financial statements and then update them for each quarter. And so a lot of the accounting firms, because they saw what happened with Arthur Andersen, was the accounting firm for Enron, and
Yep.
they were, considered complicit with Enron in cooking the books. And so Arthur Andersen went away as a accounting firm, and they were the best accounting firm, the premier accounting firm, suddenly, disbanded. And so the other accounting firms got the message, like, we have to, make sure we're not taking on fraudulent, customers,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, clients. And so,
Yeah. I mean that's what it was, Big Eight and Big Six,
right now
Big
it's like the
Four.
big 3 or 4, yeah.
The
And,
number keeps dropping.
and those companies too, they were, they had they started to get big consulting operations. So you had the accounting side, and they'd get the customers for the consulting side, and the consulting side started to make more money. And that's what happened with Arthur Andersen. Is the consulting side basically bent the ethics of the accounting side, said, we can't lose this customer. They're giving us so much money, Enron was, that you have to look the other way. And once again, you have guys that are lifers. They have a mortgage, they have a family, they have 3 cars, kids in college. They're like, I can't risk saying I'm going to stand up for what I think is right and leave this job. I have too many responsibilities to do that. So people's ethics get sort of bent incrementally, like boiling the
Yeah.
frog kind of thing. And suddenly they find themselves doing things that are incredibly illegal and to the detriment of the employees that have the stock, in their, retirement fund, and for the investors that thought that these, financial reports were accurate and all. And so all that stuff had happened. And so then, and Sarbanes-Oxley made it much more expensive to report. But I took the second company public on the same kind of premises of liquidity, pricing mechanism, easier to raise money from a whole bunch of investors instead of having a couple of big investors that are really dictating the terms of what I do. I'd rather have, a public bunch of investors, and I tell them what I've done, than some guys looking over my shoulder and saying, take the company this way, do that. Why are you doing this? I didn't want all that anymore. But it turned out to be a really difficult and challenging thing, and very expensive to do the reporting. Now, I was the CFO and the CEO in those companies. So I did all the reporting, had accounting firms that did it, did all that kind of stuff, managed it. I was able to do it at a relatively inexpensive, about 150 grand a year, expense for reporting, where anybody else couldn't believe it. They said it has to be $500,000 to $1 million for the report. And that's a big table stakes just to be a public company. But I was able to keep those costs low because I knew enough to do a bunch of that, work myself with a small staff. I didn't do it all myself, but and
Yeah.
so made it work. But after a while, I decided to um, do a private equity deal and basically take that company private again. Because I thought that private equity basically comes in and says, well, the market's underpricing this company, and if we even just value it for parts, we can make more money than what they're doing. And so they come in, buy the company, rejigger it a little bit, and then maybe relaunch it publicly or sell it for parts or peel off a couple of parts and have what's left over that they got basically for free because they, you know, covered their costs by selling some valuable parts that the market wasn't necessarily valuing properly because it was all bundled together. And so I did a deal and took that company private again. And so, yeah, that's sort of the story there. Did 10K reporting for, 10 years, and really with 15 years actually. And that's where I really started to learn all that. And in that meantime, too, I was doing that. My sister was working for some big companies, and she was at night teaching finance, corporate finance at a university in New Jersey. And when I visited her, I thought, that's so cool, teaching, what's it like, and she was loving it. It's real interesting, engaging with the students and polishing your skills so you can actually teach it. Like Richard Feynman said, if you want to really see if you understand something, try telling somebody about it or teaching it. Then you know where the holes in your knowledge are, and you go fill those in. And so I thought that was cool. So I started poking around and then got a couple of teaching, assignments at the local university here in New Mexico, and a few of them actually, and started doing that and teaching business courses and realizing, from my MBA experience and being in academia that way, and then going into the real world, which is surprisingly a lot different than academia, what they teach you in the textbooks, right? And here I am back, with these textbooks that are this thick, 800 pages on accounting, finance, marketing, leadership, strategy. Saying, man, in the day-to-day world, you don't have time to sit and ponder and cogitate all these theoretical things. They're interesting in theory, and intellectually as a proposition, it's fun to talk about these things. But when you're on the ground running, it's a street fight. You're out there, every day trying to just, make decisions with partial information and negotiate with people and figure out what's going on. And so what I started to do was, and I realized the students, they were MBA students, and they just didn't have that much of a sense of, they knew a lot of the buzzwords, but I would just
Yeah.
go into a class and say, okay, what's a balance sheet? And they'd all panic, debits, credits, they would just throw out accounting words and so, okay, here's what it is. Here's how it works. And I would get after a class, I've taken 5 accounting courses and finance courses, and I never understood what that was. And thank you, you made it really clear. And so I was like, okay, I started boiling these things down to, here's like 10 pages of what you really need to know. All the other stuff is interesting. You may encounter it one time in your career, but
Right.
you have to have some sort of a valence or a priority thing so you can see the forest through the trees, a perspective, a context. Here's the important things. Here's the fundamentals. Here's the blocking and tackling of this business, course. Um, the kind of things you're really going to need day to day. And then all the other stuff, they have a context to fit all that stuff in and say, this is a priority. This is interesting, but I'm going to use it that much. And then you can start to formulate an idea around this subject that is actually operational for you instead of having all this stuff seems about the same amount of importance. What does it all mean? And I'm memorizing it for a test. You're not going to get a test in the real world. You're going to actually have to implement this stuff in some kind of meaningful way. And so that's why I started doing that. And that's where MBA ASAP kind of evolved out of that. Like, this is not pragmatic stuff that you're learning, for the real world. It's not like learning a PhD level subject that's going to be in academia forever. Business
Yeah.
education is supposed to be used in business.
And I definitely want to unpack that. There's a couple things that you mentioned that are. I mean, it's so funny the amount of things. First off, full disclosure, I got my MBA from NYU,
Hello,
so I
school. That's a good
know.
school. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know the whole academic route, and I did it after. So I didn't go directly from my undergrad. I worked for several years first. And to your point, a couple things. One is that whole balance between the academia and the real life. One of the great things about the MBA program, I have to say there, is that what was nice is in my investment banking class, I had the academic, I had the guy that had the charts and everything else, but it was team taught by a guy who was a partner at Goldman Sachs. So he would work during the day and then come in at night and they would teach together. So he couldn't disclose the deal they were currently working on, but he could talk about older deals they did. And so you're learning the theory, but you're also learning the practicality. And if we rewind that a little bit further, it's just amazing to me that you brought up pets.com because no word of a lie. I was just telling my sons about this yesterday. So, as it happens, in the dot com boom, I was working in New York City for an IT consulting firm. And what we did was we placed people, we did system administration. So basically what we were doing is we were putting consultants in to all these dot com companies. And as you know, Some succeeded and made it, others did not. There were a lot of paper millionaires that overnight lost everything. And there were companies like pets.com where we had people there and they had these they had all these random ideas that they thought were great because they thought Google was so cutting edge, and they thought it was the quirkiness that made it great, when in reality it was the other way around. They got the right people on the bus, so then they had this cool culture that they built. You can't start with just putting in weird rules and then having, and so they would have things like, first of all, everybody could bring their pet to work. So you had, I was told that the place smelled like a barnyard because you had every pet in the world in there. And I'm not trying to pick on this one company, but it's
No.
just so funny that you brought it up. And the other part of it was, they hired a bunch of these brand new MBAs, and sure, they're Harvard and Wharton and Ivy League schools and kind of thing. But the reality of it is they didn't have a day of business experience. But they were throwing, like you said, millions and millions of dollars at people because everybody wanted to get on that IPO train. And so it was just fascinating to watch some of these companies drive themselves right into the ground with ridiculous financing that people literally just could have taken their money out back and put it in a pile and burned it.
Incinerated it,
Is
yeah.
essentially what they were doing because they're hiring people with no experience whatsoever. So it was just that whole thing was fascinating to me. But I saw some people make good decisions and go to the right places. I had, just as a funny aside, one of our consultants had two friends, and the two friends said to him, there's this company, we're going to take jobs there. I'm not really sure exactly what it's about. They do some kind of like online auction or something like that. And they're like, why don't you come with us? They need more talent, and you have a great skill set. No, 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 I'm going to stay here. I'm just going to be a consultant and everything. Turns out to be eBay. They were two of the early people in it. They cashed out millions and millions of dollars. Yeah. And poor Stefano didn't take the plunge, but you never know, right? I mean, these are the things that you don't know until you've done them. And that's the fascinating part about it. But to see all that money thrown around, that was a wonderful company that I worked for. But when the dot-com bubble burst, of course, that's where you go, and everything sort of imploded. And we went from growing, adding offices. We were 12 months before our own IPO, and we're a services company. It wouldn't have done the record numbers like some of the product companies were, but at the same time, we would have all been really well off. And then the bubble burst, and that was the end of it. And so within 6 months, I had to lay off 150 people, and then of course my turn came, and the company survived it, but they got little tiny. They stayed. They went back to Santa Clara where they were founded, and eventually, like years and years later, sold out to some private equity or something like that. But it was a great experience, and just to be around all that, and again to sort of see how the world works from that perspective. So I'm curious, with that as all the backdrop, and from being in the corporate situation, being in an academic situation, being in having founded companies, what's your take overall? And we're going to get into the whole schooling side of it too, but what's your take on wealth creation? How much of that do you feel like you learned in school versus through life experience?
Oh, that's a great question, Brett. And just talking about what the experience that you had there, that's priceless, right? I mean, I think that we learn more from, going through things, and also from things that don't work out the way that we think we are, whether we call it, success and failure or whatever. I don't believe that in failure, it's a learning experience. But that kind of thing is priceless because, especially, people say we learn much more from our failures than our successes. The guys that went off and went to eBay and all, they probably thought, I'm a genius. I knew exactly what to do. I have all the money. I now I'm going to make all these other decisions. But really, luck plays so much of a role in everything that we do, and to admit that. And then also when we have things that don't go the way we want them to go, and we start questioning, why did it not go that way? That's where we really dig in and learn, and that, I think that's the key, that over time we learn. They say, that experience comes from good judgment, and good judgment comes from bad judgment, poor judgment that generates the experience. The experience is something we get right after we need it. We learn it, and then it's like, oh, that's what I should have done. You learn it for the next time. Um, but yeah, wealth creation, that's a great topic. And I've thought about that a lot. I've written a lot on that subject. And just for my own, what do I think about it? And so I start to write my ideas down. That's how I basically write my books. Is just what am I thinking about? Let me write that down and start to build up my ideas on it. And, I would say, first of all, education is absolutely key. You have to have education, formal education, and then you also really must be an autodidact. You have to read a lot of books. Reading is a superpower now, especially because people don't do much of it. So if you have the patience and the focus to sit down and read a long form material, 200-page book or whatever, 300-page book, and get the juice out of that, other people are not going to do that, not too many. And so you really can elevate yourself, like you say, getting the right people on the bus, that good to great, Jim Collins kind of idea, all those kind of ideas that you start to assemble, and not just reading one or two books like Mad Dog Mattis said, like if you haven't read hundreds of books, you are functionally illiterate, and your experience will not be enough to sustain you. And I really think that that's true. This is where how we learn. So formal education to point you in the right directions, and then being an autodidact to say, this is interesting to me, this is interesting to me, and having the wherewithal to not scroll and not watch TV. I haven't had a TV in 30 years. I think it's, and I read, and I try to say, for personal development, I'm going to spend that time doing something that's going to be incrementally help me and improve me, and not something that's just sort of, oh, I'm too tired, I just want to watch something because that's brainless, because people use that excuse, and then you don't improve every day. But if you do improve 1% a day or something, it's going to show over time. So I think education is really critical. But then also experience, you have to put that to work. The smart person's procrastination is I have to learn more, in a way. I'm not
Yeah.
ready. I need to know more about this, and really to sort of have that ready, fire, aim instead of ready, aim, fire kind of mindset, where you're going to, you know, prepare a little bit, do something, and then course correct based on the feedback that you get from that. That's the entrepreneurial iterative journey, right?
Mhm.
Launching something before you think it's ready, like Reid Hoffman said, if you're not embarrassed by your first launch, you waited too long. You have to have something out there that is like a minimal viable something or other that then people can respond to, and you can see what what the response is. And nowadays we can measure all those responses really granularly, through all kinds of uh, data driven, web type of products. And you can see, oh, people are looking at this and not at that. And then you can refine and course correct and start to iterate and polish. I just bought a rock polisher because I think it's a great metaphor for, you put in, I don't know if you ever heard of those things. They're popular, in the 70s and stuff, but you put in just rocks, right? And it tumbles these rocks with sand. And after about, a few weeks or something, they come out as beautifully polished little gemstones,
Yeah.
and that's the kind of, because I want to remember, but that metaphor of, that's the way to work, have something that's, they say with writing, every first draft is crap, and then you polish it and you polish it, and it suddenly, gets better and better. Same thing with a business. You launch something, you see what people are doing, what they like, what they don't like, and then you polish it and polish it until it becomes something that actually has some sort of, product market fit with an audience, and then you can, engage that audience and work from there. So I think experience and not waiting too long to gain experience, and nowadays too, there's no barriers to entry, right? You can go launch a landing page and point to it with some, social media posts or some paid ads, and see if people like that, even before it could be like kind of vaporware, before it's just a concept. But if people start to like it, and then you have a little button that says sign up for our waiting list. And if people sign up, you're like, oh my gosh, I have something now. Let me go and build that, instead of spending 5 years building something and feature creep and having all these bells and whistles, and then you launch it and you get, crickets, and no one comes to it, and you wonder why didn't, this is my beautiful product, and why aren't people coming to, rushing to my new service, or something. So I think it's a combination of both, and the art is knowing how to balance those things, and what feels right about, I need to learn a little bit more about this. I'm going to accelerated learning that kind of thing until I know just enough to be dangerous. Then I'm going to launch something and see what happens. And then I'm going to, keep moving up the stack of,
Yeah, I think it's, it's a really salient point because it is sort of the ability to build the plane while you're flying, right? I mean, the best plan never executes the way that you want it to. So if you spend too much time in the planning phase, you're doing yourself a disservice because you're limiting your ability to grow. Your real growth comes from experience, right? There's that expression, right? The only way past this is through it.
yep.
You've got to go through those experiences. There are shortcuts. There are things you could do to learn all of that, but there's no better teacher than the experience of going through something, and you're going to need to adapt. So that ability to reflect, that ability to analyze, adapt, and as you said, like iterate quickly, so you can get to a point where you're getting closer and closer to the target is so vital, especially nowadays. I mean, the speed of everything is just a thousandfold from where it used to be, and so I think that's literally at this point one of the most important skills. So as we sort of go into the skills side of things, you started MBA ASAP to help educate people, and we've hinted around at this through a number of things that we've talked about. But what exactly is it, and why did you create it?
Oh, thanks, Brett. Yeah. Well, I did just to have, allow a more democratic access to these kind of skill sets and all. And I'm sure, like you at Sloan and me at Wharton, I went there in a way thinking maybe there's some kind of, secret handshake or some kind of club, some skill set that is only known to the occultists that are the Illuminati that are in this, field. And then realizing, wait a minute, it's really not. It's pretty practical stuff, build something that people want and that you build it for less than you're going to sell it for, so you make some money, and and then figure out how to create awareness on that. It's marketing, and if you can build and you can sell, you're going to be unstoppable, right? So those are the kind of things. So I thought I wanted to democratize some of that, make it accessible, and so the people that are actually out there and running with things could have these add business skills to their skill stack and have those so that it would make them, just more efficient and have more opportunities available to themselves because they understood how to talk to an accountant, how to think about marketing, all those kind of, how to negotiate a bit because we don't get, what we deserve in life. Really, we get what we negotiate, right? And so you have to have, even if it's just in your personal life, well, what movie are we going to go see, or where are we going to go to eat? Those kind of things. You have to have some negotiating skills and some communication skills. And so I wanted to put all those kind of things together. And plus, I love kind of geeking out on these subjects. So I liked putting together the content and, figuring out how best to deliver it from a pedagogical standpoint, really try to iterate and polish. And I look at those kind of, metrics of, okay, I've made a video lecture and it's 7 minutes long. I can see, how many people watch the whole thing, where they drop off. It's like, oh, geez, just, they're only watching the first 30 seconds and thinking this is not that good. I better refine that. This is an important topic, so I'm not going to just discard it, but I better refine it until they're watching, 90%, 95% of it. And so that's how I build it up. And I can actually see how many people on Kindle Direct read, how many pages is my book. Oh, they're reading this. I'll double down on this, and I need to revise that. And so that's how I really look at feedback to develop the materials from a pedagogical standpoint. And I also found that with the teaching, at universities, it's all PhDs, I came in as a pracademic. I had only my master's, and they call it a pracademic, not an academic. I have practical skills, but they kind of look down on that. It's like, you don't have your PhD, you're not doing research. And for them, those professors, it's publish or perish. It's all about publishing research. Research is what they learned in their PhD. Their PhD thesis, dissertation is research. They don't teach you how to teach in a PhD program. They teach you how to do research. So the teaching part, the pedagogy part, is sort of a sideline for them, a lot of them, and they really are focused on their research, and they do they phone it in on the course side. They go in and they'll talk for a while and stuff like that, or they'll have a teaching assistant do it and they don't even show up half the time. And so I thought about that. It's like, I want to focus on the pedagogy. How do I get this material into the other person's mindset, into their brain, so they can actually use it, not just I'm going through the motions. Now I'm going to go back and do my research. And so I felt that there was a disservice at even elite institutions with people that weren't really, their first and primary focus was not how do I school this young or this mind, that could use this material to then go and create new opportunities for themselves. And so that's the attitude I take on it, and to try to make it really accessible, limit the amount of buzzwords. A lot of it, especially in finance and stuff, you get weighted average cost of
Yeah.
capital and net present value. You throw around these buzzwords and people think that stuff must be really hard to know because it has these fancy terms to it. And then when you start breaking it down, it's like, oh, that's all it is. It actually makes a lot of sense. And then it becomes a valuable tool for you to say, I want to value the income stream of a rental property. I want to buy a rental house and it's going to, give me $2,000 of rent a month. How much then, if I take that into the future and pull it back to a present value, what's that present value? And is that present value more than the price of the asset, in this case, a house or whatever? If the present value turns out to be more than the cost, then buy it. If they want twice as much than you think you're going to make, it's not a good deal, right? And so you start to think in those ways, and you can start to understand, because really, at the end of the day, the only way that we can get ahead in this world and generate wealth, your main question, is to own assets, own income producing assets. Because at the end of the day, our money, if we're just going to save it or something, it is the Federal Reserve targets inflation at 2%. That's the kind of growth number we need. Well, that means that the money is melting in value at 2%
Yeah.
under the best circumstances. Now, it's been running at 7%, 6%, 5%, 4%. It's down to that. But if you just keep money, it's diminishing in value over time. The only way that you're going to make money is if you own assets and income producing assets, basically like rental real estate rental properties, or stocks and bonds that are giving off dividends and interest. Those kind of things are where you're going to actually be able to stay ahead of inflation and actually make money. And those are the kind of things you have to really learn and understand, how to analyze a company, how to read the financial statements, how to read their 10K, so you can invest in Google or Amazon or Tesla or whatever it is you're going to invest in. And how do you know that this one's better than that, and make that decision? You really need these kind of skill sets to navigate the world and generate wealth. And then the other side, I mean, there's four ways that you can make money, right? You can put other people's money into other companies, and that's if you're an investment analyst or venture capitalist or something. You can put other people's money into your company, and that's if you're an entrepreneur and you're taking on funding. You can put your money into your company and bootstrap it and make it that way, or you can put your money into other people's companies, like on the stock market or angel investing, and uh, acquire equity stakes in companies. Those are the four ways that you can get into assets and make money. And so that's really, from my ideas for wealth generation, you have to be doing basically a suite of all four of those is probably the best way to do it. But some combination of that.
And I think it's amazing that you're taking all of that knowledge and distilling it down, because I do think financial literacy in particular is something that we're never really taught. And so unless we go out and learn it on our own, and it's very intimidating to a lot of people. I know, being a finance, I was a triple major, but the finance side of things, I know in school, where it was very intimidating to a lot of people. They could get their arms around a lot. As soon as they start to see numbers, their eyes glaze over, they get intimidated. And so I think what you're doing is so important, because I think it doesn't need to be that complicated. You can understand it on a basic enough level, but important enough level and valuable enough level that you can use it in a way that matters. And so I think, the MBA ASAP is a really awesome thing that you're doing, because it allows people to access that kind of stuff without needing to spend, tremendous amount of money or feel like they need to be intimidated by an academic environment if they don't have the time for it either. So really appreciate you sharing that. So with that, it's just about time to wrap things up. I want to thank you so much, John, for sharing all your insights and great tips with us. Visit MBA-ASAP.com to get MBA smart without the crippling debt. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And as always, remember, no matter what you want for your business or your life, don't compromise, optimize.